The lecture hall at Eastwood University buzzed with low murmurs and the tapping of keyboards, a symphony of scholarly anticipation. The walls, lined with historic portraits of past mathematicians, seemed to watch over the crowd as a hush fell when Dr. Kenneth Whitman took the stage. He moved with the polished confidence of a man used to reverence. His reputation was etched into textbooks and whispered in corridors. Yet in the final row, nearly swallowed by a sea of blazers and tweed jackets, sat a child no one noticed until he raised his hand. 12-year-old Malachi Brooks was nearly invisible in the sea of academia. His shirt sleeves hung long over his wrists, the navy fabric faded from too many washes. He sat stiffly beside Ms. Daniels, his STEM mentor, who gave him a small, encouraging nod as Dr. Whitman's voice boomed over the sound system. "Today," Whitman declared, sweeping his arm toward the towering whiteboard, "we dissect the integration symmetry conundrum, a problem mathematicians have failed to conquer since the 1800s. As the professor launched into equations so dense they blurred like foreign script to most in the room, Malachi clutched a scuffed notebook in his lap, a hand-me-down from his grandfather, full of old notes and blank pages that now fluttered as he opened it. The numbers on the board weren't intimidating to him. They felt familiar, like puzzle pieces he'd seen in dreams and sidewalk chalk. Dr. Whitman continued, "Even our most advanced algorithms fall short of cracking this. Some believe it's simply unsolvable." The crowd chuckled politely, expecting a dramatic, academic performance. Malachi, however, was already scribbling in the margins of his notebook, mapping out the shapes hidden in the equation. He wasn't copying, he was correcting. People like to imagine that math is about inspiration. Whitman smirked as he wrote. But real math is slow, grueling, methodical. You don't solve things by seeing pretty patterns. More laughter. Ms. Daniels glanced over and noticed Malachi's pencil dancing furiously. She leaned in and whispered, "You okay?" He didn't respond. His brow furrowed as he connected two sets of symbols in the professor's formula that, to him, screamed imbalance. The theorem didn't breathe right. Something was off. From the front row, a student raised a hand to suggest a constant substitution. Dr. Whitman shut it down with a sharp tone and a smirk. "This isn't a high school quiz bowl," he scoffed. "No shortcuts here." The student sat down, cheeks burning. Malachi's eyes narrowed on the third line of the proof. He saw it, the fracture in the symmetry. Without thinking, his hand went up. It was small and unassuming, rising in the sea of prestigious spectators like a flag no one expected. A few people turned. Some smirked. Women spotted him. "Yes?" he asked, his voice tinged with theatrical patience. "You have a question?" Malachi stood. His voice wavered but held. "There's a problem in the third line," he said softly. "The variables don't maintain equivalency. It's open, not closed." Silence. Whitman blinked, confused. Then, annoyed. "I'm sorry, what's your name?" "Malachi Brooks." "And where exactly have you studied advanced symmetry frameworks, Mr. Brooks?" The condescension was thick, but Malachi didn't flinch. "Nowhere official," he said, "but I think the pattern goes beyond what's written." He raised his notebook. "This is what I see." A professor in the front stood and walked to the board. He examined the third line. Then he stopped. Another stood. Then another. Gasps rippled through the hall. Cameras emerged from bags and pockets. One student whispered, "Is he right?" Within minutes, the lecture had dissolved into stunned chatter. Dr. Whitman's confident smirk was gone, replaced by a thin-lipped frown. The dean climbed onto the stage and leaned in to speak to him. A moment later, the announcement came, "We'll be taking a short recess to review new input." Malachi sat down quickly, his notebook clutched to his chest. Ms. Daniels leaned in, whispering, "What just happened?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the patterns on his page. They made sense. Too much sense. Like they'd been waiting to be seen. Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. By nightfall, the footage had made its rounds across the internet. News segments called it the boy who outsmarted Harvard. But Malachi wasn't at Harvard. He wasn't even at a magnet school. He was just a kid from Eastbrook, a neighborhood with more pawn shops than playgrounds. In a modest hotel room near campus, Malachi sat cross-legged on the bed, eyes fixed on the television. A reporter stood beside a paused image of him holding his notebook. "Is this the future of theoretical math?" she asked the camera. Malachi barely heard. His fingers traced the lines of the pattern again. Ms. Daniels turned off the TV. "Your mom called. She's proud of you." "Scared, but proud." "Is she mad I didn't tell her about the lecture?" Malachi asked, his voice quiet. "She said she understands. Said you've always had your own rhythm." A knock interrupted them. Dean Ellis, the university's head of outreach, stood in the doorway with a crisp suit and a fixed smile. "Mr. Brooks," he said, stepping inside, "you've caused quite a stir." Malachi sat up straighter. "We'd like to extend your stay. Explore this anomaly further. With your mother's permission, of course." He glanced at Ms. Daniels. "All expenses covered. We've already spoken to her." Malachi hesitated. "Dr. Whitman, he's okay with that?" A pause. Then the dean smiled. "Let's just say he understands the value of optics." Ms. Daniels smirked. Translation: "He's not thrilled, but can't stop it." Malachi looked down at the sketch in his notebook, the one no one else had seen until today. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll stay." The next morning dawned cloudy over the Eastwood campus. Inside the applied mathematics lab, Malachi stood in the middle of a room that looked more like a spaceship than a classroom. Whiteboards stretched across every wall, covered in faint marker residue from brilliant minds past. Computers hummed quietly, and graduate students buzzed around, pretending not to glance at the kid in the hand-me-down hoodie. He didn't say much as he took a marker from the supply bin. No one told him where to start. No one needed to. He approached the board like a musician approaches a piano. Not with fear, with instinct. Rather than rewrite Whitman's original theorem, Malachi started somewhere in the middle, near the instability he had pointed out the day before. With a few strokes, he framed the error in visual cues, swirls, vectors, and lines that twisted across the surface like vines searching for light. It wasn't conventional notation. It didn't even look like math to most watching. It looked like art. From the back of the room, Professor Alina Shah watched silently, arms crossed. She'd been skeptical when she first heard about the boy. Viral moments don't equal brilliance, she'd thought. But now, watching him build a spatial framework from what should have been abstraction, she wasn't so sure. He wasn't solving the problem step by step. He was gliding through it, pivoting, sketching, pausing like he could feel when something didn't belong. His process wasn't academic. It was intuitive, a kind of quiet genius that couldn't be taught. She finally stepped closer and said softly, "Malachi, can I ask, how do you know where to begin?" He paused, then shrugged. "I don't. I just see where it's wrong. Like when a chord is off in a song." His voice was steady, eyes still locked on the diagram. "Do you play music?" "No," he said, "but I hear it when I do this." By noon, a small crowd had gathered just outside the glass door to the lab. Some were grad students, others faculty who had caught wind of the story. Everyone watched in silence as Malachi filled board after board. Not with solutions exactly, but with a new way of thinking. A different architecture of logic. One no one had dared imagine. That afternoon, the silence shattered. The lab door burst open, and in walked a sharply dressed young man whose shoes squeaked with unnecessary drama. He was in his early 20s, with a polished blazer, a smug expression, and unmistakable entitlement. "So," he said, scanning the room, "this is the boy genius?" Malachi didn't look up. He was deep in a loop, trying to resolve a symmetry issue with a visual spiral model he had invented only hours earlier. "I'm Preston Whitman," the man announced, clearly expecting a reaction. "That name should mean something to you." Ms. Daniels straightened from where she sat near Malachi. "Dr. Whitman's son," she said, almost under her breath. "Of course." Preston walked closer to Malachi's board, arms folded. "You really expect people to believe you figured this out on your own?" His tone was dripping with disbelief. Malachi finally looked up. "I didn't expect anything. I just saw what was off." Preston smirked. "Right. You, a 12-year-old from Eastbrook, just casually correct a problem no one's touched in over a century. Did your mentor coach you? Memorize some obscure Reddit thread? Come on. Ms. Daniels stood. That's enough. But Preston stepped forward. My father built that theorem. His career, his legacy, is in those equations. You think a feel-good outreach story is going to rewrite years of research? Malachi turned back to his board. I don't care about your father's legacy. I just fixed the part that was broken. Preston's jaw tightened. You're a temporary headline. In a month, no one will remember you. Ms. Daniels stepped between them. You need to leave. Now. Sure, Preston said, backing away with a mocking grin. Just remember, the higher you fly, the harder the fall. After he was gone, Malachi didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, eyes on his spirals. Ms. Daniels sat back down beside him. You okay? He nodded, but his hand trembled slightly when he lifted the marker again. That night, Malachi couldn't sleep. The hotel room felt small and full of ghosts. He turned over in bed, staring at the ceiling, notebook clutched to his chest. At midnight, he sat up and quietly reached for the phone. Professor Shah answered on the second ring. It's Malachi, he whispered. You said if I ever needed to come back. She didn't hesitate. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. The lab at night was quiet and dimly lit, with motion sensors causing soft lights to flicker on as they entered. Malachi worked without distraction, filling board after board until the markers ran dry. Shah watched silently, asking the occasional question. Most of the time, she just observed, her astonishment growing with every diagram he formed. By 3:45 a.m., he was still going. It wasn't that he had solved the theorem, but he had pushed it so far that the original problem now seemed small. He wasn't fixing a leak in the wall. He was building a new house. The next morning, Shah made a series of calls. First to the youth outreach program that had brought Malachi to Eastwood, then to his school principal, finally to his mother. Ms. Brooks, she said gently, your son is remarkable. I've worked in this field for 25 years. I've never seen a mind like his. Is he safe? Malachi's mother asked, instantly worried. Yes, Shari assured her. He's more than safe. He's ahead. They arranged for Malachi to stay longer under direct university supervision. And although the official word from Dr. Whitman remained quiet, whispers in academic circles grew louder. Something had shifted. Back in the lab, Malachi stared at a specific spiral he had drawn overnight. He didn't know why, but it felt like a key, not just to a theorem, but to something bigger. By the time the sun rose over Eastwood, Professor Shah was already dialing her next number, Malachi's school. The line connected to Principal Laird, who sounded groggy and confused until Shah explained the nature of the call. She barely finished her introduction before he interrupted. He did what? The idea that a student who hadn't yet finished pre-algebra had found an error in one of the most enduring mathematical puzzles stunned the entire faculty. When Shah offered to send transcripts of his work, he declined. No need. I've known Malachi since third grade. That boy sees numbers like other kids see cartoons. We always knew he was different. We just didn't know how different. Shah smiled faintly. Different might be an understatement. After hanging up, she called Malachi's mother again to explain the extended stay. Miriam Brooks listened carefully, her voice tired but steady. She had worked the night shift at County General and hadn't yet slept. He told me he wanted to learn something important, she said. I didn't think it would be this. Mrs. Brooks, I believe your son is operating on a cognitive level that we don't fully understand yet. He's not memorizing, he's generating. And the way he visualizes equations, he might be one of a kind. There was a pause on the line. My father homeschooled him for years, Miriam said slowly, until he got too sick. After that, I just let Malachi learn the way he wanted. Your father, Malachi's grandfather, what was his background? Hard to say, she answered. He was private. Brilliant, yes, but strange about institutions. He taught himself languages, taught Malachi to read Latin at 7. But he never liked questions about his past. Shah made a note in her notebook. Do you think I could speak to him? About Malachi's development. I doubt he'll talk. He doesn't trust academics. Or the government. That response sparked a new curiosity in Shah. She returned to the lab just as Malachi was sketching what looked like a three-dimensional matrix. only it wasn't a cube or grid. It was organic, like the cross-section of a pine cone if it were written in algebra. Malachi, she said gently, can you explain this to me? He didn't look up. It's a loop that bends back on itself, but not completely. Like a memory, or an echo. His voice was soft, focused. It's not solving the problem. It's seeing past it. She was about to ask more when the door opened. A young man in a leather jacket stepped inside. Not a student, not a faculty member. He looked around cautiously before making his way to Shah. I'm sorry, but are you Professor Rima Shah? Yes. He handed her a sealed envelope. This is from Dean Ellis. He asked that you review it personally. She opened the envelope and skimmed the contents. Her eyes narrowed. They're requesting a formal review of the boy's intellectual property. What does that mean? Malachi asked from across the room. It means, Shah said carefully, they're preparing to claim ownership of your work. Malachi looked at her blankly. But it's just math. She walked over and crouched beside him. In academia, just math can mean control, reputation, funding, and power, especially when it has implications people don't fully understand yet. Malachi looked down at his notebook. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't, she said. You revealed a crack in a wall that everyone thought was solid. Now, they're trying to control who gets to walk through it. That afternoon, Shah invited Malachi to her office. It was a small corner space filled with plants, dusty books, and floor-to-ceiling whiteboards. I want to try something, she said. Explain to me how you think. Not the answers, not the math. How you see it. Malachi hesitated, then said, it's like sound. When something's wrong in a pattern, I hear it. I don't mean actually hear it, but I feel in my chest, like a vibration that doesn't sit right. She sat forward, intrigued. You're describing a form of synesthesia. Some people hear colors or see sounds. Maybe you're seeing math in a multisensory way, shapes, feelings, rhythm. He nodded slowly. Sometimes I can't sleep because the patterns won't stop. They spin, and if I don't write them down, they twist out of place. You're not broken, Malachi, Shah said softly. You're gifted. It's just a gift people don't recognize yet. Outside her office, in a nearby administration building, Dr. Whitman was in a heated discussion with Dean Ellis. This is outrageous, Whitman said, pacing. A child does in 48 hours what I've been refining for 15 years, and we're just going to hand in the keys to the department. Ellis sighed. Kenneth, the world has already seen the video. There's no going back. What we need to do is manage it, gently. Whitman leaned over the desk. I want a background check. On the boy. On his mentor. On his grandfather. I want to know if anyone in that family had access to high-level data. That's reaching, Ellis replied. No, Whitman said, his tone cold. That's protecting what's ours. The next day, Malachi returned to the lab to find that someone had copied his diagrams and was circulating them to faculty. He overheard a conversation in the hallway. Words like government use, pattern recognition algorithm, and proprietary breakthrough. Shah pulled him aside. You need to understand something. The patterns you've mapped aren't just beautiful. They may relate to how encryption works. Information security. Government-level mathematics. Malachi's eyes widened. But I don't know anything about that stuff. Maybe not directly, Shah said. But someone might have once. A chill passed through him. His grandfather's cryptic warnings about using knowledge carefully echoed in his mind. I think I need to talk to him. Malachi returned home later that day, escorted quietly by Ms. Daniels. His mother met them at the door, concern etched into her face. Are you all right? She asked, stepping aside to let him in. Malachi didn't answer right away. He walked past her, eyes fixed on the hallway that led to the small back room where his grandfather spent most of his time. Joseph Brooks was seated by the window, as always, reading a worn paperback whose spine had long given up. He didn't look up when Malachi entered, but he closed the book gently. I saw the news, he said. You've been busy. Malachi sat down in the wooden chair across from him. Grandpa, people at the university think I didn't come up with the work on my own. They're saying maybe you gave me something. Joseph's eyes finally met his grandson's. They were sharper than usual, clearer somehow. And what do you think? I think I saw something that didn't fit. And I just fixed it. Joseph nodded slowly. That's what I hoped you'd say. Did you work on this before? The problem I solved? Joseph leaned forward on his cane, the wood creaking slightly beneath his hands. Yes, a version of it. A long time ago, I was part of a project no one talks about anymore because it was supposed to stay buried. What kind of project? A government-backed, mathematical think tank during the Cold War. Our job was to model systems, predict behavior, build frameworks for understanding what couldn't be understood yet. Weather, economics, human movement, encryption. Malachi swallowed. Like the diagrams I made, Joseph's eyes held a mixture of pride and sorrow. You found your way to them without knowing where they came from. That's what makes you special. I taught you the tools, but you used them in a way I never could. But now people are saying it's not mine. They're saying it because it scares them, Joseph said softly. What you've discovered could change how digital systems operate, how secure data is. Governments don't like losing control. Malachi's hands fidgeted with the edges of his notebook. They want to classify my work. Joseph's mouth tightened. That's the first step. Then they'll try to own it. They tried with me. I walked away. Why? Because they didn't want understanding. They want control. Just then, Miriam entered the room with 2 mugs of tea. She set them down gently and joined the conversation. He's right, she said. That's why he never told me everything when I was a kid. I used to think he was just paranoid. Joseph offered a small smile. I probably was, but I was also right. Malachi glanced between them. So what do I do? You decide if you want to fight, Miriam said quietly. Because if you do, we'll stand with you. Later that evening, as dusk crept in through the blinds, Professor Shaw called again. Her voice was urgent but calm. Malachi, there's something you need to know. Dr. Whitman has requested access to classified research archives under your name. He's trying to prove your work is derivative of stolen information. Malachi's chest tightened. I didn't steal anything. I know that, Shaw replied. But he's going to use your grandfather's history to make it look like you're part of some larger plot. Why would he do that? Because he's losing control of the story. And when powerful people feel threatened, they change the rules. Malachi looked down at his notebook. Is there any way to stop him? Shaw paused. We're preparing a legal response. But it might help if we went public on our own terms. Tell your story. Show people what really happened. Malachi hesitated. You mean like a press conference? Yes, with your permission. If we wait, they'll define you before you can define yourself. The following afternoon, the community center down the street from Malachi's apartment was transformed into an impromptu media hub. Cameras lined the folding tables, cords snaked along the floor, and the local news vans idled outside. Malachi sat in a side room, fidgeting nervously while Miriam adjusted the collar of his shirt. Joseph stood by the door, silent but present. Shaw entered a moment later with a clipboard and a calm smile. You ready? No, Malachi admitted. But I'll do it anyway. They stepped onto the small stage together, the crowd of journalists instantly snapping photos. Shaw spoke first, laying out the timeline and clarifying that Malachi's insights were entirely original. She showed slides of his diagrams, explained his unique visual approach, and spoke about the attempts by certain parties to discredit him. When it was Malachi's turn, he stepped up to the microphone with shaking hands. I never meant for all this to happen, he began. I just saw a problem that didn't sit right, and I tried to fix it. He glanced at his notebook, then out at the room. People say I couldn't have done this alone, but I wasn't alone. My mom works night shifts so I could study. My mentor gave me the chance to be in that room. And my grandfather, he taught me how to ask questions. Reporters leaned forward. Flashbulbs popped. I don't want to own math, Malachi continued. I just want people to see that sometimes the way we teach it, the way we gatekeep it, is what stops the next idea from coming. He looked directly into one of the cameras. This isn't about Harvard, or institutions, or who gets the credit. It's about a kid noticing something strange and asking a question. That's all. When he stepped away from the mic, there was silence. Then, slowly, a wave of applause. What no one noticed, not at first, was the black SUV parked across the street. Inside sat 2 men in dark suits, watching the press conference through tinted windows. One of them scribbled something into a notepad. We'll need to accelerate this, he said. 3 days after the press conference, Malachi sat on the floor of Professor Shah's home office, surrounded by a sea of loose papers covered in swirling equations. The room smelled of jasmine tea and old books, and the quiet hum of her desktop computer provided the only background noise. This had become their daily routine. Each afternoon after school, Malachi came here, not to Eastwood's lab, not to Harvard, and definitely not back to the spotlight. Here, it was just about the math again. "Look at this," Malachi said, holding up a paper filled with intricate shapes. "When you stretch the symmetry into 3 dimensions, it locks perfectly into a sequence. Like a key." Shah leaned over his shoulder and squinted. "Wait, is that what I think it is? It's not the same as the original theorem. It's something else, but it uses the same structure. Like encryption, but cleaner." Shah's expression shifted from intrigued to deeply concerned. "Malachi," she said carefully, "do you understand what you've just created?" He shrugged. "It's just another way the pattern folds. I was testing how far it could go." Shah exhaled slowly. "No, it's not just another pattern. This might be a master key, a structure capable of unlocking most modern digital encryption. You may have just developed the mathematical skeleton of the world's most powerful decryption tool." Malachi's eyes widened. He leaned back against the wall, the implications sinking in. "That's not good, is it?" Shah shook her head. "Not if it falls into the wrong hands." He stared down at his notebook, suddenly seeing the lines as something far more dangerous than beautiful. "What do I do?" "For now, we don't tell anyone else," Shah said, already gathering the pages into a folder. "We encrypt everything, and we think very carefully about what this becomes." That night, Dr. Kenneth Whitman sat in his Harvard office, staring at a report marked urgent. He tapped his pen against the desk, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Yes, I understand the implications," he said into the phone. "But the boy isn't on campus anymore, and his family's lawyer is already involved." A pause. The voice on the other end was cold and clear. "Of course I see the opportunity," Whitman snapped. "If I position myself as the academic authority to interpret his work, I control the narrative. I can translate it for application, frame it as the culmination of decades of institutional guidance. The prize will follow." After he hung up, Whitman sat back and stared at the framed award on the wall, his Presidential Medal of Science. It gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a monument to all his years of carefully calculated legacy building. But now that legacy was cracking. His son, Preston, hadn't returned his calls in days. The next morning, Dean Ellis knocked on Whitman's door, looking flustered. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "A tech firm CEO, Maxwell Walsh from Quantum Lock Systems, is trying to reach the Carter family directly." Whitman stood sharply. "What's he offering?" "Mentorship, funding, a private research lab, possibly even relocation to Silicon Valley." "Damn it." Whitman ran a hand through his hair. "That vulture's going to swoop in and poach the discovery." "Do we know what the family said?" "Not yet. But if Walsh gets control of this kid's equations, we'll be left on the sidelines of the biggest breakthrough since public key encryption." Whitman's jaw clenched. "Where's my son? He still has access. He might be useful." Preston Whitman, however, was not answering calls for a reason. After his humiliation in the Eastwood lab and his father's increasingly erratic behavior, he had quietly transferred to a small liberal arts college focused on philosophy and ethics. The boy who had once sneered at Malachi's hoodie was now watching replays of the press conference, the lines on his face showing something close to guilt. That evening, Preston parked his car outside the Brooks apartment building. He wasn't entirely sure why he was there. Maybe to understand, maybe to apologize. From a sidewalk, he saw Malachi and his mother walk toward a small park down the block. Malachi was carrying a thick book under one arm and sat quietly on a bench while Miriam took a phone call nearby. Preston approached slowly, hands in his coat pockets. "Hey," he said softly. Malachi looked up. His eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "To talk, if that's okay." Malachi didn't respond, but didn't tell him to leave either. Preston sat a short distance away on the bench. "I wanted to say, I am sorry for the way I treated you." Malachi looked down at his book. "Why now?" Preston hesitated. Because my dad is doing something wrong. And because I was raised to think that being right meant being better. That anyone who didn't look like me or talk like me couldn't possibly be smarter. But you proved otherwise. Malachi didn't answer, so Preston continued. He's trying to take your work, Malachi. He's planning to file property claims. Frame your family as having mishandled sensitive information. I've seen the emails. Malachi's eyes widened. He can't do that, can he? He's trying. But if people knew what he was doing, if the truth got out before he could spin it. At that moment, Miriam walked over quickly, voice stern. Malachi, who is this? Preston stood. Preston Whitman. Dr. Whitman's son. Her face hardened instantly. You need to leave. Mom, wait. Malachi interrupted. He says he wants to help. Preston nodded. Your mother knew my father at Harvard. He drove her out. I found the records. What he did, it was wrong. I don't want him to do it again. Not to your family. Miriam's jaw tightened. She looked between them, torn. You know he'll try to bury the story if he can, Preston said. Let me help before he does. That night, Professor Shah opened her inbox to find an encrypted email from an anonymous address. Inside were dozens of internal documents, emails between faculty, outlines of strategy sessions, and even budget allocations for a shadow committee calling itself the Conclave. As she read through the files, a pattern emerged. This wasn't just about Malachi. This was part of something bigger, an institutional effort to quietly claim promising research from students outside the traditional pipeline. Shah reached for her phone. She needed help. Professor Shah didn't sleep that night. The contents of a leaked email chain haunt. Deher, some of the most respected names in academic mathematics, were implicated in a network that had, for years, identified high potential students, mostly from underserved backgrounds, and found ways to appropriate or suppress their research. The emails referenced past cases, code names, even contacts at government agencies. And at the center of the latest one was Malachi Brooks. By sunrise, Shah was on a call with her old colleague from MIT, Dr. Janice Lin, a computational theorist with a history of whistleblowing. It's more than just Whitman, Shah said quietly. There's a group. They call themselves the Conclave. They've done this before. You sure it's not just institutional bias dressed up in paranoia? They're too organized, Shah replied. Too careful with their phrasing. They've buried careers before they could bloom. And now they've set their sights on Malachi because he saw something none of them did, and because his name isn't already carved into the ivy. Lynn was quiet for a long moment. You're going to need to make this public. I know, Shah said, but I need to protect Malachi first. That morning, while reporters still hovered near the apartment building, Malachi sat in the living room with his mother and grandfather. His mother's face was pale as she ended a tense call with the school district. They've filed a complaint, she said, her voice shaking. Harvard's claiming educational neglect over your homeschooling. They want to send child services. Malachi froze. Can they do that? They're hoping we'll panic, Joseph said grimly. This is what they do. Isolate the target. Scare the family. Apply pressure until you cave. Ms. Daniels was already dialing a civil rights attorney. Within the hour, Laura Bennett, a fast-talking legal powerhouse with a sharp gray bob and a sharper wit, was in their living room reviewing papers. This isn't about educational concerns, she said. It's a coordinated maneuver. But they've made a mistake. Malachi's work is protected under academic free speech. We're filing a counterclaim this afternoon. As legal documents were being prepared, Malachi sat quietly in his room. The math no longer felt like his refuge. It felt heavy now, as though the equations themselves carried too much weight, too many consequences. His mother entered and sat beside him on the edge of the bed. You didn't do anything wrong, she said softly. I just wanted to show it was possible, he whispered. I didn't mean for it to get this big. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Miriam pulled him close. You didn't hurt anyone. You opened a door. Some people are afraid of what's on the other side of it. That's not your fault. I wish I'd never raised my hand. No, she said, lifting his chin. You spoke your truth. Don't ever regret that. Not when the world needs more of it. The following morning, headlines broke across every major academic outlet. Bryce Whitman had gone public. In a sit-down interview with a major network, he laid out the entire strategy. his father's efforts to discredit Malachi, the falsified accusations, and the systemic practice of harvesting research from vulnerable students. I was raised to believe that genius was a bloodline, Bryce said in the interview. That if you didn't speak our language or wear our jacket or come from our world, you couldn't possibly be one of us. But then I saw Malachi's work. I saw what he saw, and I knew I had to choose between loyalty to a legacy and the truth. The fallout was immediate. Students across Ivy League campuses organized protests, demanding transparency and justice for Malachi. Donors threatened to pull funding. A petition calling for Dr. Whitman's resignation garnered over 100,000 signatures in under 48 hours. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, a young Nigerian mathematician named Adebayo Okafor published a paper building on Malachi's approach. Using his framework, Okafor demonstrated an elegant new method for encrypting sensitive medical data in regions without advanced infrastructure. The Carter method, Okafor wrote, is not just a discovery, it's a reimagining of how we engage with patterns. It invites us to listen, not just compute. Malachi read the article 3 times, stunned. He called it the Carter method. Joseph smiled over the rim of his coffee mug. Your work's going places you've never even dreamed of. That afternoon, Professor Shaw met with Malachi and his mother to discuss the next steps. There's a movement happening, she said. But it's important people hear from you, Malachi. In your own words, I think it's time you wrote a letter. Something to remind them why this matters. Malachi hesitated. I don't know what to say. Just be honest, Shaw said gently. Say what you see. With her help and the quiet encouragement of his mother and grandfather, Malachi drafted a simple, open letter. It was raw, vulnerable, and utterly sincere. I never wanted to own ideas. I just wanted to understand them, the letter read. Math, for me, isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about noticing what others miss and sharing it, so everyone can see something new. If my work helps one other person feel brave enough to raise their hand, then it's worth it. The letter spread faster than the news stories. Scientists, teachers, students, even CEOs shared it with captions like, "This is what genius looks like," and "The future of education has spoken." For the first time in weeks, Malachi smiled as he watched the ripple effect of his own words. He didn't feel like a stolen headline anymore. He felt seen, not for what he corrected, but for why he cared. The storm outside had passed, but the air still carried the scent of summer rain as Malachi sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. His notebook rested on his knees, pages marked with spirals and angles he hadn't dared explore in weeks. Something in him had shifted. The fear, while still present, was no longer steering him. It stood behind him now, quiet, watchful, acknowledged but not in control. Across the room, Joseph was on the phone with Professor Shaw, reviewing plans for a new initiative that had taken shape in the wake of Malachi's letter. The Carter Initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program designed to find students like Malachi, the ones who didn't test well or fit the mold but saw the world differently. Students who, given the right space, might also change it. Shaw's voice buzzed faintly over the speaker. We've already received our first round of donations. Anonymous benefactors, mostly. Tech companies, some former alumni, even a few rival professors. The tide's turning. Joseph nodded slowly, eyes flicking toward his grandson. He turned it. That same day, Harvard released a carefully worded public statement. They acknowledged the extraordinary contribution made by Malachi Brooks and expressed regret over procedural lapses in the treatment of his research. Buried at the end of the statement was a final line that resonated far beyond its bureaucratic tone. Dr. Kenneth Whitman has tendered his resignation, effective immediately. Malachi read the announcement in silence. Then he looked up at his mother. Is it over? No, she said gently, but it's changing. Outside, a mail carrier knocked. Miriam opened the door to find a large envelope addressed to Malachi in gold lettering. Inside was an invitation, an official letter from TEDx Youth, requesting that he speak at their global event the following month. He held the letter in both hands, unsure whether to feel honored or overwhelmed. Do I have to? No, Joseph said. But maybe you want to. I don't know what I'd even say. Say what you see, Miriam replied. That's always been enough. Weeks passed in quiet preparation. Shah and Ms. Daniels helped him craft a talk that wasn't about the math, but about the way he experienced it, the music behind the numbers, the emotions and symmetry. He practiced every night in the living room, adjusting his pacing, his posture, his voice. Each time, he grew a little more confident, a little less afraid. The day of the event arrived crisp and clear. Malachi stood backstage in a navy blazer 2 sizes too big, staring at the red TEDx logo painted on the stage floor. The crowd beyond the curtain sounded like waves crashing in a storm. Shah adjusted his microphone and whispered, "Just be you." Then the host called his name. He stepped out slowly, the lights momentarily blinding. Cameras turned, phones lifted. He reached the circle in the center and took a deep breath. "I don't think I'm a genius," he began, voice small but steady. "I just see things differently." He paused. No one moved. "To me, math isn't about right answers. It's about rhythm. It's like a story that wants to be told. And sometimes the story gets stuck. That's when I know something's wrong. It's like hearing a wrong note in a song." The crowd leaned in. "I didn't fix the equation to be impressive. I did it because I could hear that something wasn't flowing right. I wanted to make it feel complete." He moved to a display behind him and began tracing one of his spiral patterns with his finger. "Some people said I couldn't have done it because of where I come from, because of what I wear, because of who my family is. But none of that has anything to do with seeing a pattern. Patterns don't care about zip codes." Laughter broke softly, warm, and supportive. "When I raised my hand in that room, I didn't know it would start a fight. I just knew I had to say something." He looked out at the crowd, now utterly silent. "I don't want to be the only kid who gets that chance. I want everyone to feel safe raising their hand, even when it shakes, especially when it shakes." By the time he walked off stage, the audience was on its feet. The video went viral within hours, translated into 27 languages in a week. Headlines read, "The boy who taught the world to listen to math. ND, courage, curiosity, and the equation that started a movement." Malachi's world changed again, but this time it didn't shake him. He was anchored now, not in fame, not in fear, but in the quiet understanding of what his voice could do. Back home, his school welcomed him with less fanfare than expected, which suited him just fine. He returned to class, walked the halls like any other student, except now a few more kids raised their hands when the teacher asked a hard question. One of them even said, "I thought about the rhythm like you said." And it helped. That night, Malachi sat at the kitchen table with Joseph, both of them bent over new notebooks. "It's funny," Malachi said. "The problem I raised my hand for, I don't even think about it anymore." "That's because you finished that song," Joseph replied. "Time to start writing a new one." Malachi smiled, pencil tapping against the page as a fresh shape began to take form. Autumn crept gently across the city, coating sidewalks in gold and rust-colored leaves. Life had returned to something resembling normal, at least as normal as it could be for a 12-year-old who had unintentionally disrupted the academic world. Malachi's days were quieter now. His teachers were more protective, his classmates a bit more reverent. But slowly, the whispers and stares began to fade. He was no longer just a kid who beat Harvard. He was Malachi again, the boy who loved numbers, who drew in spirals, who got lost in silence during lunch because he was thinking about balance and equations, not gossip. At home, the Carter Initiative had taken root. Professor Shah and Ms. Daniels spent most afternoons with Joseph at the dining table, piecing together infrastructure for the first national pilot program. Their goal was ambitious: locate overlooked mathematical talent in underserved communities, support them, and protect their contributions. Not just scholarships, but long-term mentorship, legal support, safe access to research. "They're not just students," Joseph had said. "They're seeds. You don't throw them into rocky soil and hope. You dig and water and stay." One afternoon, as Malachi worked quietly on a diagram for a new problem he'd been developing, his mother walked in holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, her tone unreadable. Inside was a formal invitation, on embossed university stationery from Harvard. They wanted to honor Malachi's work by unveiling a statue on their main campus in his name. A gesture of atonement, they claimed. A symbol of inclusivity. Malachi stared at the card, then looked up at his grandfather. "Do I have to let them build it?" "No," Joseph said, without hesitation. His mother sat beside him. "You don't owe them a statue. But if you want to inspire someone who walks by that building one day, it's your call." Malachi thought quietly for a long time. Finally, he asked, "What if I asked them to use that money for something better?" His mother smiled. "Now that's your grandfather talking." Malachi's formal reply was respectful, but firm. He declined the statue and instead proposed that Harvard allocate the funds toward a youth mathematics collaborative in Boston, one not limited to their own institution. "Build a space," his letter read, "where students like me don't have to be exceptional to be seen." Within weeks, Harvard announced a partnership with the Carter Initiative to create that very center, under Malachi's terms. "No gates, no uniformes, no entrance as on walls." The same month, Professor Shah was nominated for a Global Teaching Innovation Award for helping change the culture of academic access, the press release said. But what mattered most to her wasn't the recognition. It was watching Malachi, on a cool October afternoon, stand at the front of a makeshift classroom in East Brooks Community Center, teaching fourth graders how to build patterns with string and circles. He didn't use big words. He didn't mention theorems. He just said, "Listen to what it feels like when it starts to click." That's where the magic is. That night, Joseph gave Malachi a journal. A new one, leather-bound, like the one his grandfather had kept since the 60s. "You've finished one story," he said. "Time to start the next." Malachi opened it to the first blank page. "Where do I even begin?" "Start with a question," Joseph replied. "That's always how it starts." The question came a week later, while Malachi was watching birds dance in the sky. They weren't flying randomly, he noticed. They were following invisible rules, patterns written in the wind. The way they curved together, broke apart, then reunited, there was math in it. But not the kind you could chart with a line. This was more like rhythm, geometry in motion. He began sketching that night. Curved arcs that spiraled into each other. Formulas that moved instead of staying still. He called it a live system, and it didn't fit into any traditional framework. When he showed it to Professor Shah, her eyes widened. "Do you know what this could mean for modeling climate systems? Or even human group behavior?" Malachi shrugged. "I just wanted to see if I could follow their shape." Back at Harvard, Dr. Kenneth Whitman watched from the sidelines, now a disgraced figure in academia. His efforts to reclaim the narrative had failed. The scandal had cost him everything: his chair, his reputation, even the legacy he'd been so obsessed with preserving. He'd sent Joseph a letter, one last attempt to frame his role as misunderstood genius, perhaps even victim. Joseph had never responded, and he never would. Instead, Joseph now spent his days beside Malachi, working quietly in the background of something much larger. He no longer feared the formula. He trusted the boy. That winter, the Carter family received another letter, this one from the White House. The president thanked Malachi for reminding the nation that brilliance comes from all places, and sometimes the most powerful change begins with the smallest voice. Attached was a private note. "Keep asking questions." Malachi folded the letter into his notebook, not for attention, but as a reminder that it wasn't about the crowd. It was about the curiosity. As the snow began to fall outside their window, Malachi returned to his spirals, each one slightly different, each one chasing a new possibility. The world had tried to define him. Now he was defining it. Spring broke quietly across Eastbrook, replacing the icy winds of winter with warm gusts that rustled window shades and coaxed flower beds back to life. Inside their modest apartment, the Brooks family had settled into a new rhythm, one less defined by outside pressure and more by inner purpose. Malachi was still 12, still in middle school, still fascinated by the way numbers curved through space like music. But now, his thoughts reached further. The Carter Initiative had expanded faster than anyone expected. It had already launched regional hubs in 4 cities, with plans for 7 more by year's end. Applications were pouring in, Kids sending in drawings, questions, voice memos, even paper towel scribbles full of shapes and equations. Malachi read everyone. Look at this one, he told Shah over video chat one afternoon, pointing to a child's sketch of intersecting loops. She doesn't know it, but she's halfway to polar coordinates. Shah smiled. Then maybe she's not halfway. Maybe she's already there, and we're the ones behind. Meanwhile, the Boston Youth Mathematics Collaborative, the center Malachi had insisted be built in lieu of a statue, was nearing completion. The steel framework gleamed under the construction lights. Professor Shah, now its acting academic director, walked the site daily with a hard hat over her headscarf, clipboard in hand, overseeing every detail. It would be unlike any academic building in the country. No classrooms marked by rank, no gifted separation, just spaces designed for thinking, drawing, discussing, and questioning. An entire campus built around the principle that talent lives everywhere, but opportunity does not. Not a monument, Malachi had told the architects. A doorway. 10 months after the press conference, Malachi sat on the fire escape outside his window, notebook in hand, when Miriam joined him with 2 mugs of tea. "You've been quiet today," she said, offering him one. "I'm thinking about the next problem." He flipped the journal open, revealing a series of new sketches, spiraling movement patterns he'd noticed in crowds, how people avoided each other naturally without even realizing it. "I think there's a formula to how people give each other space. Maybe even empathy." Miriam laughed softly. "You're trying to find a math in feelings now." Malachi shrugged. "Maybe feelings are just patterns we don't know how to describe yet." She didn't argue. After everything that had happened, she'd learned to stop doubting how far her son's mind could stretch. A few weeks later, the Carter Initiative held its first in-person gathering, a weekend retreat at a camp outside Baltimore for the first class of scholarship recipients. Malachi walked among them like an older brother, answering questions, showing tricks with string and circles, offering quiet encouragement. That night, under a canopy of stars, the group gathered around a fire pit. One of the younger students, a boy from rural Montana named Lucas, asked a question everyone had been dancing around. "Weren't you scared? You know, when it all blew up." Malachi poked at the fire with a stick, then nodded. "I still get scared, but it's different now. I think being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about speaking anyway." Another student asked, "What do you think would have happened if you never raised your hand?" Malachi didn't answer right away. He stared at the embers, then said, "Someone else would have seen it eventually, but maybe not the same way, and maybe not in time." Professor Shah, sitting nearby with Joseph, glanced at the boy and smiled quietly. That evening, when most of the camp had gone to bed, Malachi stayed behind. He took out a fresh notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. "Every voice has a pattern. Every pattern deserves to be heard." It would become the Carter Initiative's motto. Over the following year, Malachi continued developing his live system theory, an evolving framework that applied mathematical rhythm to real-world dynamic behavior. Researchers from across disciplines joined the conversation, using his concepts in areas as diverse as ecology, AI development, crowd logistics, and mental health modeling. He didn't try to patent it. He didn't try to own it. He just kept writing, refining, and sharing. One afternoon, the family received an unexpected visit. A woman in her 60s, dressed in a neat navy coat, stood at their door with a small box tucked under one arm. "I'm Dr. Elise Harper," she said. "I worked with your grandfather in 1971. Joseph, now a little slower in movement but sharp as ever, stepped forward. "Elise," he said softly, "after all this time, I've been watching," she said, "and I wanted you to have this." She handed the box to Malachi. Inside were yellowing documents, notes scribbled in code, and a faded photograph of Joseph and Elise standing in front of a chalkboard, smiling like conspirators. Tucked beneath it all was a letter in Joseph's handwriting from over 50 years ago. "I wrote that after I walked away from the project," Joseph explained. "I didn't want the knowledge to disappear. I just wanted to bury it until the world was ready." "Do you think it is?" Malachi asked. Joseph looked around the room. His daughter, strong and unshakable. His grandson, thoughtful and fearless. Elise, returned with old truths and new hope. "I think you made it ready," Joseph said. A year to the day after Malachi first raised his hand at Eastwood, the Boston Youth Mathematics Collaborative opened its doors. Cameras flashed, dignitaries gathered, and students walked its halls for the first time. Malachi didn't speak at the opening ceremony. He just watched from the back as a nervous young girl approached a problem wall and picked up a marker. She hesitated. Then, slowly, her hand began to move. Later that night, Malachi sat alone in the central rotunda beneath a skylight, the stars above dimmed by the city but still faintly visible. He opened his notebook and began to write, not equations this time, but a letter. To whoever's reading this. If you see something different, say something, even if your voice shakes, even if no one listens at first. Because sometimes the quietest question changes everything. He closed the book and leaned back, letting the silence wrap around him like a familiar blanket. The world outside still buzzed with noise, debates, theories, systems. But inside this space, built not from concrete, but from courage, something else buzzed louder. Curiosity, wonder, possibility, and a boy who simply dared to ask. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Carter Collaborative Center as a new school year began. It was exactly 1 year to the day since the center had opened, since Malachi's quiet act of courage had bloomed into something that could no longer be contained. He stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby, watching students arrive. Some were wide-eyed, clutching notebooks and hope. Others walked with confidence, already used to the idea that this was a place where questions weren't punished. They were celebrated. Malachi sipped from a paper cup of tea, leaning against the railing, when Joseph appeared beside him. The older man still moved with care, his cane a rhythmic tap on the tile, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "They look different than we did," Joseph said. Malachi followed his gaze. "Yeah, they look like they expect to belong." Joseph gave a soft chuckle. "That's what we fought for." Downstairs, a small girl no older than 9 dropped her pencil pouch. A boy next to her bent down to help, and the two quickly settled into a corner near the spiral sculpture, a new addition to the lobby made from stainless steel and painted glass, modeled after one of Malachi's first sketches. They didn't seem to care that it had once made headlines across the globe. To them, it was just beautiful. Later that afternoon, Malachi joined Professor Shaw in the media room. She was prepping for a live virtual panel about institutional reform in STEM education. "They're still trying to make you the face of it all," she said, adjusting her scarf and glancing at him from behind her glasses. "You ready to be their hero?" "I'm not trying to be a hero," he replied. "I just want to make sure the next kid doesn't have to fight that hard to be heard." She smiled. "Then say that. Say it in every room they invite you into. And say it louder when they try to cut your mic." The live stream kicked off. Panelists from Oxford, MIT, and even former members of the Harvard board dialed in. When it was Malachi's turn to speak, he kept it simple. "I don't think we need more geniuses," he said. "We need more listeners. Because the next solution might not come from the loudest room. It might come from the quietest kid in the farthest seat." The chat exploded. Viewers from 26 countries tuned in. That evening, the Carter family gathered for dinner, like they always had, around a table slightly too small for the stories it now held. Miriam had made red beans and rice, Joseph's favorite. Malachi spoke little, mostly listened as his family discussed the day. Afterward, Joseph handed him an old envelope. "I was waiting for the right moment." Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned, faded, but sharp enough to show a younger Joseph standing with civil rights leaders in the 70s outside a courthouse. Behind him, someone had scrawled on a signboard in chalk, "Every system is just a pattern waiting to be redesigned." "That's your legacy," Joseph said. "Not the math. The mercy." Malachi held the photo for a long time. Later that night, he walked through the empty halls of the center, passing new murals of abstract equations drawn by students. Messages left in marker like, "This is the first place I felt smart, and they let me stay weird here." He entered the soundproof dome at the center of the atrium, the one he'd designed with the architects as a thinking chamber. There, with only his breath and heartbeat as company, he sat on the floor, opened his newest notebook, and wrote. They called a correction, but it was always a conversation. One hand raised, one world shifted, and with that, he closed the journal, stood up, and walked back into the world. Not as a boy with a spiral, but as the man who had redrawn the shape of possibility. 3 weeks after the first anniversary of the Carter Collaborative Center, something unexpected happened. A girl named Raya, 11, shy, always scribbling in the corners of her notebooks, raised her hand during a group session. She wasn't the loudest in the room. In fact, she was barely known outside her cohort. But when Professor Shah called on her, Raya quietly stepped forward and pointed at the spiraling sculpture in the atrium. "Why does it always spin clockwise?" she asked. Shah paused. "What do you mean? I've been watching it every day. The light hits it, and the movement always favors the same rotation. But if we flip the pattern, if we let it spin counterclockwise, it would reflect a whole different kind of symmetry. I think we've only been studying one half of the spiral." There was silence. Then someone murmured, "Whoa." By the time the session ended, 3 other students had joined Raya at the sculpture, testing reflective light angles and sketching inverse arcs. That night, Shah emailed Malachi a single line, "It's happening again." Malachi didn't respond immediately. He was in Seattle, speaking at a summit on decentralizing education models. But the message stayed with him, looping in his head. Another quiet voice, another raised hand. He took the first flight back. Back in Eastbrook, Malachi met Raya the next morning. She was nervous, standing next to the sculpture with a sketch pad and a pencil bitten at the ends. "I didn't think it was important," she told him, "but I kept seeing it." He smiled. "Most people don't notice the spin. You did. That makes it important." Instead of correcting her, Malachi sat beside her on the floor. They talked spirals, gravity pulls, and emotional intuition. She wasn't solving equations. She was reading energy and instinctively trying to rebalance it. That same week, Shah proposed creating a new branch of the Carter Center curriculum, the Reversal Lab, a space where students could reimagine existing systems by flipping perspectives. What if we read the problem backward? What if we reverse the role of student and teacher? What if silence wasn't emptiness, but information? Within a month, it became the most attended elective in the building. Meanwhile, Miriam had begun developing a parenting course called Raising the Pattern. She worked with low-income families, helping them recognize signs of latent talent in children, not just through grades, but through how they moved, how they organized their clothes, how they structured their daydreams. "Talent hides in the quiet," she said in an interview. "We just never taught parents where to listen." The interview aired on public radio and ended up reaching nearly 4 million listeners. Calls flooded the Carter Center's voicemail the next morning, parents asking for guidance, not for enrollment, not for gifted programs, just for the words, "How do I help them shine without burning them out?" In response, the center launched a mobile outreach program. Converted school buses retrofitted with projectors, modular classrooms, and shelves of colorful math games. They call them spiral buses. Each one bore the same phrase, painted acro. SS the back. The answer might be in the next town over. Malachi visited the first bus during its test run. It had pulled up in a rural Pennsylvania town with no math teacher at the elementary level. He sat on a stool as second graders ran experiments with marbles, paper ramps, and mirrors. One kid shouted, "It bounced left." "That means it worked." Malachi turned to the driver and whispered, "We need 100 of these." Back at the center, Professor Shah watched as a new generation of thinkers began reshaping their own paths. The traditional system had once tried to contain minds like Malachi's, labeling them either prodigy or problem. Now, those labels were dissolving, replaced by something simpler: curiosity. Raya, who had once been too afraid to speak, now ran a small workshop called Unspin the World for students under 12. Her first exercise? Take a familiar object and flip it upside down. Redefine what it does. One boy turned a stapler into a pressure-based coding device. A girl reimagined a backpack as a memory-capturing time capsule. And slowly, one flip pattern at a time, a second wave of thinkers emerged. Malachi watched it all unfold quietly. He didn't lead from the front anymore. He was in the halls, in the workshops, sometimes just listening. His greatest power now wasn't answering, but stepping back to let others discover. That night, Joseph and Miriam joined him on the rooftop garden built atop the center. They sat beneath solar-powered string lights, with a plate of leftover rice and beans between them. Joseph leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. When I was your age, all I wanted was to be heard once. You've created a world where kids are heard before they even know how to ask. Miriam added softly, you made space. Malachi looked out at the city skyline, lights twinkling below like stars turned inward. I didn't make the space. I just refused to let it stay empty. From the far end of the rooftop, they heard laughter. A group of students from the dorms were playing a late-night game of math charades, using body movement to act out equations. One kid bent into a curve. Another shouted, "Parabola!" The rooftop filled with cheers. Joseph laughed, and Malachi just sat there, still quiet, notebook in hand. He wrote one last sentence before closing it. Legacy isn't built in brick. It's built in permission. The permission to ask, to notice, to flip the spin. By the second anniversary of the Carter Collaborative Center, the phrase "flip the spiral" had begun appearing in places Malachi never imagined. Painted on school walls in Detroit, carved into a student-built sundial in Nigeria, and stitched on jackets worn by inner-city chess teams. It wasn't just a saying anymore. It had become a signal that questions had value, that silence could hold intelligence, and that brilliance didn't have a blueprint. And yet, even movements that spark with light begin to attract resistance. A week before a televised education summit, Malachi received an invitation, not from an ally, but from the very university that had once refused to hear him. Harvard. The dean wanted him to participate in a televised roundtable about equity in STEM learning. Malachi stared at the email for a long time. Professor Shah entered his office just as he clicked it shut. "You going?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. "Feels like walking into the lion's den with a flashlight." She smirked. Maybe it's time the lion got a better look. At the summit, the panel was lined with familiar faces, tenured professors, corporate sponsors, policymakers. All wore polished smiles. And then there was Malachi, seated quietly at the end, sleeves rolled up, his spiral pin glinting faintly on his lapel. The conversation began diplomatically. Terms like accelerated access, closing opportunity gaps, and pipeline repair echoed across the room. But when a moderator turned to Malachi and asked, "What do you believe the real issue is?" he didn't blink. "The system doesn't need fixing," he said. "It needs replacing." A murmur rippled through the room. The current model was built on the idea that knowledge flows one way, from top down, expert to novice. But if we've learned anything, it's that the next breakthrough can come from the kid building patterns in chalk on a sidewalk. One professor challenged him. "But how do we scale curiosity? You can't grade it." Malachi's reply was simple. You don't grade it. You grow it. You protect it. By the end of the summit, the hashtag Protect Curiosity was trending across educational communities. That evening, back at the Carter Center, Malachi entered the archive wing, a quiet room lined with glass cases containing handwritten journals, student-submitted theorems, even Raya's early sketches of reverse spiral models. He paused in front of one new addition, a cardboard mobile made by a 9-year-old boy named Elijah from Kansas. It hung delicately, perfectly balanced. The note beneath read, "This is how my brain feels when people actually listen." He stood there longer than expected. The next morning, Miriam called him into a planning session. She had a proposal, one that didn't involve buildings, lectures, or press. "I want to go hyper-local," she said, spreading out a map. "Let's create micro-centers in the most overlooked zip codes. One van, one mentor, one table." Malachi raised an eyebrow. Just one," she repeated, over and over until they can't be ignored. They called it the One Spiral Project, and it began quietly. A single camper van in Baton Rouge fitted with math manipulatives, art supplies, musical instruments, and old laptops. Instead of testing, kids got time. Instead of tutors, they got mentors who asked, "What do you notice?" instead of "What do you know?" Soon, Parents began joining the sessions, and then grandparents, and then retired teachers who had long lost faith in the system. The movement wasn't growing upward, it was spreading outward. Meanwhile, back at the center, Raya had developed a new workshop, Quiet Doesn't Mean Absent. In her first session, she invited the students to close their eyes for 30 seconds and write down whatever came to mind: shapes, sounds, memories, ideas. No rules. Just record the invisible. One boy, normally unresponsive in class, turned a page filled with spirals and branching arrows. Raya held it up. "This is what insight looks like before it has language," she told the group. That page would later become the center's official logo. Joseph, now mostly retired and taking more naps than meetings, often sat by the windows in the East Wing reading letters, handwritten messages from children across the globe. "My teacher says I'm weird. Your program says I'm brilliant. I don't know if I'm good at math, but I like how it feels in my stomach. My mom said we can't afford smart. I told her we already had it." He read each one twice, sometimes 3 times, and often, quietly, he cried. One afternoon, Malachi joined him, sitting in the sunlit silence. Joseph handed him a letter, already open. It read, "Dear Mr. Malachi, I saw a bird land on a power line and wondered if that's a pattern too. I'm going to write about it every day until I figure it out." Beneath the letter was a child's drawing, a bird with wings extended, loops in the sky above it, shaped like spirals. Malachi folded the letter carefully and placed it into his notebook. Then he looked at Joseph. "Do you think we've done enough?" Joseph's eyes twinkled. "If a child sees a bird and finds a pattern instead of just a feather, then yeah, I think we've done more than enough." But Malachi didn't stop, because curiosity never ends. It just finds a new shape. By now, the world no longer saw Malachi as just the kid who corrected Harvard. He had become something larger, a symbol not just of intelligence, but of refusal. Refusal to shrink brilliance into boxes, refusal to define worth by test scores, refusal to let silence be mistaken for absence. But with that symbol came weight. In the 3rd year of the Carter Center, Malachi began turning down major interview requests. His face appeared less on magazine covers. His voice, once on every podcast and panel, began to retreat from public echo chambers. One evening, during a wind-heavy walk through the Eastbrook Hills, Miriam caught up to him. "You've gone quiet," she said. "I'm listening," he replied. She nodded. "To what?" He looked out at the tree line. "To what's next?" What was next, it turned out, wasn't another center or summit. It was a letter from a prison in Ohio, from a man named Cole Dawson, mid-50s, serving a life sentence for armed robbery. In neat block handwriting, he'd written, "Someone snuck your math videos into our block. I never liked numbers, but the way you spoke made me feel like maybe I wasn't broken, just unseen. I started drawing spirals in my cell. Then I started counting patterns in the way footsteps echo through bars. I've written a book of those echoes. I don't know what it means, but I feel like it means something." Malachi read the letter 4 times. Then he booked a flight. The warden was skeptical at first. "You want to teach math to inmates?" But eventually relented. Within a month, the Carter Spiral Project was piloting inside 3 correctional facilities. They didn't call it math class. They called it reconstruction, not just of numbers, of identity. Dawson became the first pattern fellow behind bars, and soon, 20 others joined. They weren't solving equations for exams. They were identifying trauma cycles, survival patterns, even rhythms of loneliness. One man mapped the shape of grief after losing his mother during incarceration. Another charted the rise and fall of his stuttering as he gained confidence speaking aloud. When asked what the project was about, Malachi told a local reporter, "It's not about making them smarter. It's about showing them they already were." Meanwhile, back at the Carter Center, Raya had graduated from student to junior instructor. She now mentored a new group of kids, many of whom reminded her of herself. Quiet, observant, careful not to take up too much space. But under her watch, they bloomed. One afternoon, while hosting a Redesign the System session, a boy named Marcus raised his hand and asked, "If patterns can be reprogrammed, can people too?" The room froze. Raya didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out her original notebook and turned to the first page, the one with the counterclockwise spiral and her scribbled question, "Why does it always go this way?" Then she said softly, "That's what we're doing here. Every day." In recognition of the Carter Center's global ripple, the United Nations Educational Alliance extended an invitation for Malachi to deliver the keynote at the annual Future of Learning Assembly. It was a huge honor, but he hesitated, not because he was unprepared, but because he didn't know if that version of himself was still necessary. He'd started this journey by raising his hand, but now hundreds of hands were raised. Thousands. He discussed it with Professor Shaw over coffee. "You don't have to be the voice anymore," she said. "But if you do speak, speak for the ones still finding theirs." So he went. The event was held in Geneva. Educators, innovators, world leaders from over 90 countries filled the room. On stage, Malachi stood in his usual way. No teleprompter, no slides, just a worn spiral notebook in hand. And this is what he said. "They say you only raise your hand if you know the answer. But I raised mine because I had a question. And I think that's where change begins, not in knowing, but in noticing. Patterns can be prisons, but they can also be bridges. We get to decide which." I wasn't trying to be heard. I was just refusing to stay invisible. And every child in every forgotten classroom deserves that same refusal. We're not here to fix the system. We're here to outgrow it. The applause came slowly at first, then all at once. Later that evening, Malachi stood alone outside the assembly hall, watching snow fall gently over the cobblestone streets. He thought of Joseph, now resting at home, his strength fading, but his spirit still stubborn. He thought of Miriam, who had just opened the third spiral bus route in Mississippi. He thought of Cole Dawson, writing his second book from a prison cell turned laboratory. And he thought of that spiral, the one he'd drawn years ago in a classroom no one remembers. He pulled out his notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote, "Asterisk, the pattern isn't the point. The point is that we get to choose a new one." Asterisk, and somewhere, across a flickering hallway light, a child lifted their hand. Back home, in Eastbrook, autumn had begun to sink into the trees. Leaves fell like quiet reminders that even brilliance must rest. The Carter Center remained vibrant, humming with projects, student breakthroughs, and visitors from around the globe. But Malachi had slowed down, not out of fatigue, but out of reflection. He had spent the last 5 years growing the world outward. Now, for the first time, he needed to look inward. One morning, Miriam found him sitting on the steps outside the center, coat wrapped tight, spiral notebook on his knees, but no pen in hand. "You haven't written in a while," she said. "I know," he replied. She sat beside him, pulled her own scarf tighter. "You're allowed to pause," she whispered. Malachi exhaled slowly. "I keep thinking about the boy who raised his hand. Not the symbol. The boy." She looked at him closely. "Do you miss him?" He nodded. He wasn't tired. He wasn't watched. He just wanted to ask a question. Miriam reached for his hand. "You're still him. But now you've made it safe for others to ask first." The silence between them was warm, thick with memory and meaning. Later that day, Malachi wandered the archive wing, touching the glass cases gently as he passed. Raya's flipped spiral, Cole's prison sketch journal, Elijah's bird drawing. They weren't just student projects. They were artifacts of transformation. At the end of the hallway, he paused in front of a small frame newly added to the collection. It was a note scrawled in crayon on lined paper, crooked and uneven. "I thought I was dumb. Then I found your spiral. Now I think maybe I'm just early." He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the sentence settle into his chest like a stone and a flame at once. That evening, Joseph's condition took a turn. The once indomitable mentor now spent most of his days in bed, eyes sometimes clear, sometimes fogged with the weight of time. Malachi sat beside him as the nurse stepped out, gently placing a soft blanket over his shoulders. Joseph blinked slowly and smiled faintly. "Still chasing spirals?" Malachi smiled back. "They're everywhere now. Some I didn't even design." Joseph's voice was raspy. "That's how you know it's working." They talked softly, drifting through memories. The diner where they first discussed systems. The night Joseph first showed him his chalkboard full of curves. The moment Joseph, with all his own buried genius, stepped aside to let Malachi rise. Then Joseph whispered, "You were never just smart. You were brave." Malachi held his mentor's hand tighter. "Because you were first." Joseph gave one final, slow nod. "Don't forget to rest. Even spirals stop and still stay beautiful." Those would be the last words he ever said to Malachi. Joseph passed 2 nights later, quietly in his sleep, as the wind curled through the eaves of the house he'd built with his bare hands. The funeral was held at sunset on the Carter Center rooftop. No casquets, just a circle of chairs, candles lit, and memories shared. Malachi read from Joseph's old journal, passages not of equations, but of fears, hopes, and dreams buried too long beneath the world's expectations. When it was his turn to speak, Malachi stood tall. "He didn't give me the answers," he said. "He just believed I had them." After the ceremony, Malachi sat alone, the city's soft lights stretching beyond the horizon. He opened his notebook and wrote one word: grief. Then he stared at it, turned the page, and on the next, drew a spiral, softer this time. Not calculated, not symmetrical, just honest. Because some spirals don't have to be solved. Some are meant to be felt. A few weeks later, an unexpected envelope arrived. Inside was a legal document. Joseph had left his small family home, the one with the old garden and the sun-warmed porch, in Malachi's name. Attached was a note: "A place for you to remember stillness. Grow flowers, not just theories." Malachi visited it that same afternoon. The yard was overgrown, bees moving slowly over the clover, and wind chimes ringing unevenly. He sat on the porch, watching the sway of tall grass, and realized something. Legacy wasn't the buildings. It wasn't the books. It wasn't even the spiral. It was this moment, this air, this silence earned. Later that week, Malachi returned to the center, not to teach, not to lead, but simply to watch. In the courtyard, he saw Araya speaking to a group of new students. One of them raised their hand, not with hesitation, with pride. He didn't step in. He didn't need to. 5 years after the Carter Center opened its doors, Eastbrook looked different. The streets were still cracked. The traffic lights still flickered. But something had shifted, not the buildings, but the people. Kids walked to school, talking about probability curves like they were pop lyrics. A local cafe held open problem nights instead of open mic. And on the library wall, in bold spray paint above the entrance, someone had written, "This town doesn't wait for permission to be brilliant." Inside the center, the morning sun spilled across glass floors and chalkboard-painted walls. Students were already deep in group sessions, arguing gently over fractals, rewriting old logic puzzles, building models from discarded plastic. Every hallway buzzed not with pressure, but with permission. Malachi moved quietly through it all, like a current. He no longer introduced himself. He didn't have to. He spent his days now walking, listening, sitting beside students instead of standing in front of them. He sometimes went hours without saying a word, but his presence had become its own kind of language, like gravity. Unspoken, but undeniable. One afternoon, a small boy named Theo sat alone on the courtyard bench, holding a half-built pattern in cardboard. He looked frustrated. Malachi approached and sat beside him, silent. Theo stared at his creation. "It's broken," he muttered. Malachi didn't respond. After a moment, Theo glanced sideways. "Aren't you supposed to tell me what to fix?" Malachi shook his head gently. "That's not my job." "How thou in? Then what is?" Malachi smiled. "To sit with you until you see it differently." They sat there a while. Theo didn't speak again, but eventually he picked up a piece of cardboard, flipped it upside down, and smiled. That night, Malachi returned to Joseph's old house. The porch was lined with mismatched potted plants now, gift from former students, mentors, even strangers who had heard the story and wanted to send something that grew. He poured tea, opened the screen door. Saturday. No notebook, no lesson plan, just stillness. That was when he heard it. Soft footsteps on the front walk. A woman in her early 30s approached, holding the hand of a little girl. They paused at the edge of the garden. The woman waved shyly. "Sorry," she said. We didn't mean to intrude. Malachi stood slowly, gently. You're not. She motioned to the girl. This is Maya. She's the reason we're here. The little girl stepped forward, clutched something tight to her chest. Malachi knelt down to her level. I brought you this, she whispered, unfolding a drawing. It was a spiral, bright, uneven, colored with every crayon in the box. But what caught his breath was what circled around it, tiny stick figures, each one holding hands, none of them raising theirs. He looked up at Maya's mother. She smiled. She told me yesterday, I don't have to raise my hand anymore. They already know I'm worth listening. Malachi blinked back the sting in his eyes. He reached out, took the drawing, and nodded slowly. This, he said, is everything. They shared tea on the porch. No big talk, just laughter, lightness. And when the stars began to appear, Maya pointed up at the sky. Are the stars part of the pattern too? She asked. Malachi looked up, thought of Joseph, of Raya, of Cole, of every voice that had once trembled before speaking. He replied, softly, maybe, or maybe the pattern starts where the stars stop. That night, as wind rustled through the garden and the lights of Eastbrook glowed steady in the distance, Malachi sat with Maya's drawing in his lap. And on a new page in his journal, he wrote, they don't need to raise their hands anymore, because the room already listens. He closed the book, not with a period, but with a spiral, not ending, just beginning.